Staci, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
You came through Stringham, took real estate classes. First time I ever met you was in our live review, and immediately your little pushback on me, I was like, we are going to be tight like this. So I'm really happy. Actually, I consider you a good friend as we've corresponded online, and now you show. I appreciate you being here because your brain is the one I want to pick for this topic.
It's entirely mutual. It's not that I want to pick your brain, but all the other stuff.
Good. I've told Rachel a lot about you, so we were both, when we had this idea to talk about this topic today, the differences in gender in real estate, with what the NAR has come out in their statistics for 2017, I think, 2017, because they're doing 2018 stats this year. I was like, we got to have Staci. She's going to just dissect this and cut it through and give us all what we want to know about the crazy sexes. That's what we're going to do. That's the way we're both here, right? Yes. Battle of the sexes.
Yes.
So I'll be the snarky one, right? The toxic masculinity one.
Oh, yeah.
And you two can, right, gang up and put me in my place.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, sometimes Brian and I disagree about some gender things. So
Sometimes.
Oh.
yes.
Like, but usually she comes my way
I'll
because
do
she
my
sees I'm
best
right.
to settle in this case.
Okay. All right. So just so everyone kind of knows, you've done research, you have publications in gender differences, right?
Yeah.
What are some of kind of the topics of those publications that you've done?
For example, one of my very first research projects and publications that we did was that we were studying demographics on vulnerable populations and who were more likely to be victims of crime, who are more likely to have certain fear levels, what that might look like. And so, of course, sex, and we have to be careful with the term sex and gender, because sex is a biological characteristic, a chromosomal XXXY, and gender is societal. Expectation. That's why we say gender roles. And so, people who may be born male but don't identify as male, that's why we would use the term gender as opposed to sex. And I will not use those two interchangeably when we talk.
Yeah.
So.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
Even though I used it incorrectly like 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, that's why I said gender and you said sex.
All right, so vulnerable populations, which you brought your service dog.
I did.
And you do work with hospice and that kind of, with the vulnerable, you said sexual assault victims, things like that.
Yep, domestic violence.
Okay. Okay, so any other topics of publication besides that, or is that kind of primarily been your focus?
I've done other topics in publication. I do a lot of work on memory and memory recall and how we encode things from our immediate and short-term memory and how we encode those into our long-term memory, and what learning strategies we can use to create effective tools so that we can incorporate things into our long-term memory.
So you are the woman to ask about why men can literally hear the instruction and then be like, 5 minutes later, you didn't tell me that, right? And then the joke that the woman, the first female referee, she threw a flag from a penalty that happened in 4 seasons ago, right? You're the woman to ask about why they cannot forget, and men, we just seemingly do.
Well, as you actually pointed this out in the state online class about research that has been done with fMRIs, and when you put males or females into those machines and you give them a series of words, you will see that if you give a male a word, the brain will light up in one spot. But if
because it's the only part that works, right?
it's the part that's compartmentalizing whatever that is.
Yeah.
But you give a woman the same word, their brain lights up all over the place. And there are very specific reasons for that. So, for example, I'm trying to think of the neutral word that I used.
You told me yesterday on the phone, coffee table.
Coffee table. Okay, so coffee.
Very safe word.
Yep.
Normal, object.
Neutral word. So for coffee table, for example, a man may think, oh, okay, color, shape, blah, blah, blah. A woman, however, particularly a woman with children, may think sharp edges. Someone's going to hit that. Where is it placed in the room?
Yeah.
Does it go with everything? So there's...
I've already thought of all those
See,
things.
and I sensed that, and I'm like, calm down. I could sense the
And like
anxiety
past
building.
experiences we've had with coffee tables. Yeah.
2-year-olds hitting their head and whatnot. Yeah, and that's actually part and parcel, not just with neutral words, but you see even further with words that connote danger. So, for example, cancer. Women's brains will still light up more than men's, although men's will light up a little bit more on a danger word than a neutral word.
That makes sense. Yeah, because I mean, regardless of sex, it's going to be the survival instinct that kicks in.
Correct.
So, but it's fascinating that it's the non-danger words that we really see the difference, right?
Yeah, for the most part, except for when we're talking about high trait anxious individuals, and then they tend to see threat where there's no threat, and that includes men.
Yeah.
So
I can totally see that. Yeah, okay, good. So with that kind of background that we see from these MRI studies, there is some biological differences. And you and I talked on the phone that some of those can be kind of pruned through culture and
Indeed.
and really I don't want to say exaggerated, but kind of grow and mature in those differences as well, right? So what kind
absolutely.
of cultural things do we see that help exaggerate the differences?
Okay. Let's start by giving like a 10-second background. When a fetus is in the womb, the nervous system actually overproduces neurons, dendrites, and by the time a baby is born, fully half of those have been pruned off already. And so we go through our lives, the first 24 years of our lives, in very certain cycles where major pruning happens. First couple years of life are very key. That bonding and attachment creates pruning. Adolescence is another time. And right before early 20s, mid 20s, when the frontal lobes become fully developed, we see that pruning again, which is why we see often bipolar and schizophrenia manifest in the early 20s, is because the brain is pruned that way. But when we're talking culturally, the brain prunes according to the information that we're given or not given. And so when we get into the stats about women in real estate, we'll see how this bears out as far as test taking and things like that and why that happens. So for example, my generation, I'm in my 40s, when I was growing up, STEM was not targeted. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, for those who aren't aware of that term, weren't geared toward women. And so very often, because we're not given that information, our brain prunes in a way that makes it more difficult as we're older to take in that information. It's like trying to learn a new language when you're 70, when you've never spoken another language. And so if you're not exposed to, say, mathematics and science, it's not that you would be any less capable of doing math and science if you were exposed to it, but the brain prunes accordingly. And so culturally, because traditionally we have had a separation of the sexes for a long, long time, that's why we see a lot of those differences, is because math and sciences, for example, were targeted toward men. And so men are seen as having maybe more logical brains, or et cetera, et cetera. We're going to see less and less of that, I think, with like my grandkids' generation, because now we're targeting STEM toward both sexes. Yeah. And
okay, so
that'll change.
There's the, I totally hear what you're saying. My question is, there's going to be that difference in aptitude, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about, is the women of your generation, and I think even to some degree my generation, right under you, there is a difference in aptitude. Now, there's going to be exceptions to every rule, of course.
You bet.
But I also saw, growing up and going through school, that women, the females like in my class, just not a lot were interested. Not a lot of, not talking about competency, but just the general interest in those. Is that because they got messaging or pruning that they, it wasn't geared for them at early ages, or is there some kind of biological basis of there's not a lot of interest or as much as males in those STEM fields?
I think it's largely cultural, because a lot of that pruning happens so young, and if you're raised in a family with more traditional gender roles, then by the time a person gets to school, they're already going to have a predisposition, because biologically, boys and girls in the womb, we're much, much closer. Our brains are much closer they're much more similar than they are different. And so that pruning, once outside the womb, starts to happen. And you can see it, not just with familial relationships, but in cultural relationships as well. So, this varies also too by state. Utah is a little more of a conservative state, has slightly more conservative gender roles. And so that's why you may see some more differences in a place like this than, say, certain places in California or on the East Coast. Certain southern states that have traditional gender roles also. So it will vary state by state and then country by country.
Yeah, I can imagine.
As well,
sure.
according to, the skill sets and how people are raised to think about their own role as male or female.
Okay, cool. So with that basis, right, our cultural, our biological kind of predispositions to go into the STEM versus the non-STEM fields. Now we go into real estate. So NAR came out with their member profile for 2017, right? And every year they do this. They take the prior year's statistics, they poll all their members, and they gather all the data, and they come out with this, thick book of data. And so 2017, not a lot of difference from 2016 in that two significant statistics always pop out to me. Number one is the number of women to men, and number two is the kind of that what's the right word? I guess prototypical realtor, like the typical realtor, right? So let's talk about those two.
Sure.
Number one is the difference in ratios with men and women. We have, according to NAR, 2 out of every 3 realtors are female. And I have not gone back through the data and the statistics, but I imagine that wasn't always the case. I imagine that at some point in our history it was more lopsided with men. So at least now we know that over the past couple of years it's been predominantly female. Why? What's the appeal to women? What draws them in? Where it's outnumbering men?
I think there are several factors. First of all, the workforce is again shifting. More and more women are entering the workforce, and there are several reasons for that. And a lot of it is financial. It is unless one partner in the relationship has a really good job, it almost always takes 2 incomes to raise a family.
Yeah.
The cost of living is high, just
or
almost
3 or
everywhere.
4 sometimes.
Right. Yeah. I don't think I've ever worked less than 2 jobs, even even with teaching and stuff like that. And so that's part of it. I think flexibility is part of it, in spite of the strides that we've made in sex and gender equality. Women still bear a brunt of the housekeeping, the child rearing, etc. So that provides flexibility there.
Flexibility there in the sense that they can take on those roles and still work.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Okay. And that is a fabulous thing about real estate. Yeah. I mean, depending on how you approach it and how, for example, for me, this is kind of a side gig, as opposed to like my primary job. And that's, I'll see that shift, I imagine, that will become more equal over the next year or two. But the ability to control your workload while you have so many other responsibilities, I think is key. Also, it's shown that most of the fields that women traditionally go into are helping fields, because women tend to have very strong interpersonal and intrapersonal skills. And so that would make sense why they would tend to perform well in real estate.
So, with that, do you believe that women, typically, of course, generally speaking, look at real estate as an avenue to help rather than, make these, prodigious commissions, these huge commission numbers? Because I think that men will look at real estate as this avenue to go sell and therefore make good money. But you and I had this conversation on the phone yesterday, and I thought it was pretty illuminating that there's a pretty strong pull on work home balance, that flexibility and being able to
Absolutely.
still control the home and the kids and everything else that's
You
needed,
bet.
but still make a little bit of money on the side. So is money really a driving factor, do you think, or is it more these other benefits that come from real estate?
I think it depends on the age group that you're speaking with, because when we look at millennials, millennials tend not to define themselves by their ability to have children or
that
to
true?
buy. Is that true?
That's true.
You're a millennial too.
Don't start.
And so we see a lot of younger women that are going into fields like real estate where that might very well be financially driven.
Okay.
When we're talking about the demographic that pops out as far as the 53-year-old,
Yeah,
I
which we're
believe,
gonna get to, yep.
woman, I think it's not as financially
Okay.
driven. It's not like I'm all about making money. It's
It's more of the helping and the balance.
right, and making enough to supplement any other income, excluding like single mothers and things like that who
Yeah.
have to, rely on that one income.
Okay, so that's the good segue into this demographic. The tip, according to NAR, typical realtor is a 53-year-old woman.
53-year-old.
Yep, 54-year-old white female who attended college and is a homeowner. So, I mean, I think that I was shocked. Every time I see that number, I'm always shocked because I don't know, maybe it's misperception of who's out in the field. But I was really surprised that the average realtor is, in their 50s and female. So, we're talking about the baby boomer generation. Why? What's the draw?
I think there are a couple of factors in play. Oftentimes, women of this particular age, kids are out of the house, and they may have fulfilled, and often it's not their first career. So we have to bring that up. It's a second career, but often when the little birds fly the nest, women want to pick up meaningful work. They want to do something with their time, and real estate is an excellent way to be flexible and still do that. And if you're a people person, and a lot of women are, and I think part of why we talk about how women perform well in the field, it's the empathy factor. And that's
Because I could give a crap less about my clients when I'm out there.
right. Yeah, and
all about you, Brian.
and you say that all the time. I mean, it's amazing you have any.
All right.
It's because he doesn't.
So, yeah. I
That's
don't
why
right
he had to
now,
start
but
a
That's a good
school.
point. Yes. So, Staci and I were talking on the phone yesterday about this what she was talking about, flexibility and this age group. I'm curious your opinion. She mentioned that the females typically, they don't like to be caught at work, right? On this tour of duty, this structured schedule, like in the boardroom or in the meeting until 4:35, 6 o'clock at night. And so real estate offers this flexibility, right? We can work and still take care of the sick kids. We don't have to be at work while the kids are sick, kind of thing. Do you resonate with that?
Yeah, well, I have always pretty much worked full time and done real estate as well. And being a mom and a professional, it's the most difficult thing has been childcare and the kids. And when a kid is sick, it's just like scrambling to figure out what to do or who's going to watch the kids. Either I have to stay home or my husband has to stay home. And so it's hard. And so I can definitely see the appeal of having a flexible career where you don't have to be somewhere at 9 to 5. And so I definitely can see that.
Well, and furthermore, when we look at that, now we're legally, we can't discriminate against women who are pregnant or who have children, but we all know that there are many, many, many bosses out there that absolutely do not like it if your kid has the flu and you have to, or a snow day or something like that, because they see what you're doing in terms of sheer productivity.
Yep.
And so when you're not meeting those needs, and in fact, there's been a lot of research that suggests that women who are pregnant or have young children will not get hired, but there will be another reason that they didn't get hired. When the reality is bosses foresee that, okay, kids gonna be sick, things are gonna happen.
And that has always been like a fear of mine going into interviews or anything like that. And I never even, being pregnant, I've never even gone into interviews like when I was showing, just because I felt like, my chances would go down.
Right.
And even if they knew I had young kids, even though
Wait, you have young kids? You didn't tell me that in your interview.
You actually asked me, which
Okay.
is illegal, but
It's illegal.
he still hired me, so it's okay. So yeah, I can totally understand that and empathize with that.
Well, and I would tend to agree, because the focus then becomes during the interview on your pregnancy or
Yeah, and not my skills, not my background, not
Correct.
my credentials.
right. Well, and we live in a world where there's still a glass ceiling. Women make 83 cents on the dollar still compared to men. And so anything that has to do with that family care decreases not only your chances of maybe getting the job, but can likely decrease your salary or your income as well.
Yeah.
So that's not uncommon.
I know that when I was in law school, my wife was working full time. Most stressful thing was when kids were sick. And we were in Cleveland. And it's the
I'm sorry.
sinus infection capital of the world.
Next
right?
to Fort Wayne.
Yeah, I think it's
my
second.
goodness.
I think it's the second most
Sounds
desirable place to start a practice for ear, nose, and throat specialists.
Wow.
Was because of all of that, the muck that goes on in the winter. So we had our 9-month-old when we moved out there. So that first winter, and my wife had no more leave, no more approved time off. And so she was sending me emails in class. The daycare just called. I'd have to cut class. I mean, it was stressful, but it was more stressful on her because she felt so confined.
Sure.
So I think as I can totally see that liberating, feeling of
Absolutely.
having control as a real estate agent, right? So we go into the stats, and we see that the typical agent is a 54-year-old woman. 2 out of 3 agents are realtors. But then we see, women, sorry. But then we see that this is significantly different when we talk about commercial real estate.
Absolutely.
Now, to be fair to the stats, only 2% of realtors go into commercial real estate. There's just not a lot of resources that commercial agents need from NAR. It's much more, prone to housing, residential.
You bet.
But I think that the statistic inference is still there, that the field is it has a huge disparity compared to the residential field, that more men go into the commercial,
Absolutely.
or at least, there's more men in there. So why? What's the difference between the sexes in that preference, residential versus commercial?
I think there are 2 factors in play, and again, I think we're going to see that change over time with the generations that are being raised now. That are going to be raised to, their brains are going to prune a little bit differently as a result. But traditionally, business owners are men.
Okay.
Especially when we're talking about big corporations, large commercial businesses. And men prefer to deal with other men. men in those positions of power tend to prefer to deal with other men. And I mean, we really just have to shine a light on the fact that there is a real sexist component to that, because I'm sure this has happened to you as a competent professional. You may be engaging in a dialogue with a man who is in also a prominent position, and he is not necessarily using the full capacity of your
I can think of an example. Yeah.
and so you know, I know
This isn't me, is it?
No.
Okay, good.
I know that I've had situations where I was speaking equally to a professional, whether it be a colleague or a judge or a lawyer or whomever, and they're not looking at my eyes.
Yeah.
And
They're looking at your forehead?
Yes. About
2 feet down from your forehead.
Right.
Okay, I'm with you.
I mean, in law school, we had a judge come speak to our class. It was a very small class because it was a specialized subject. And after, we were invited to come and ask him questions and talk to him. So I was really interested, and I wanted to talk to him. He just seemed completely disengaged. And then one of my male classmates came up and started asking him questions, and he just was very engaged with him, took him seriously, and just completely disregarded me. And so that was one of the moments where I just felt like, wow, being a woman and a future attorney, it just felt like I already have this disadvantage.
Right.
Maybe you
So,
were just boring.
Yeah. And it's not only is it not uncommon, and we're seeing how we're, like with the Me Too movement, we're shining such a light on this. Not only is that not uncommon, but because people who are raised in more traditional gender roles, women included, are so used to it, they don't even recognize it when it happens to them often. And so they won't confront it, they won't shine a light on it, they won't engage because they're just used to it.
So they just don't even try because they just are afraid to
they may not even be self-aware about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so the male business owner listing business or property with a commercial agent tends to want to deal with men, traditionally speaking. So
Correct.
Therefore, I mean, is that the drive for men to go into commercial agent real estate?
Well, again, we're talking demographics. When we're talking about that kind of older demographic, I think absolutely.
Okay.
I think that's exactly why they're geared. It will be interesting over the next 20 years to see what that's going to look like as more women become business owners, and more young men and women are being raised equally educationally, how that is going to shift in the future. But right now, I believe that's the case, particularly when we're talking about middle age and above.
Okay.
Do you think that some of the drive for men to go into commercial is because, like Brian said, he doesn't care about his clients, and so they're more, commercials more.
I'm the snarky one in this episode, not you.
There's more detachment, I
Commercial
think.
is detached business. You're not dealing with homeowners.
Much
and
more
so-
arm's length.
Yes,
Yeah.
much more. So, and then women don't find that as appealing,
Right.
and so they don't really want to go into that as much.
And also because culturally, men have been traditionally raised to be the breadwinner. There's money in commercial real estate,
Yeah,
and
more
so
lucrative.
there's men tend to be, particularly of the middle age and above generation, tend to be more financially driven that way.
But with more money comes more stress. The commercial deal is going to be far more stressful on average than the residential because of all of the legalities involved. Usually there's attorneys involved with that along with the real estate agent. Deals will take, a period of months rather than weeks to close and consummate. So does stress, that perceived stress, have anything to do with it?
Actually, I'm not sure that is necessarily the case, that stress is necessarily the case. I think that men tend to be able to detach more easily from that stress.
Ah, okay.
It's not necessarily. I don't think that a lot of men think about it as so stressful in that regard, but a very certain personality type goes into certain fields, and I would be interested to see if the individuals that went into commercial real estate are type A, that tend to be, very driven that way, and they thrive on stress and challenge. And so if I were to hypothesize something, I would say that that's part of it, because if you look at that 2%, I bet you just about anything that a lot of them are very type A, very driven. They have a huge internal locus of control. And so that's part of it.
Yeah, because I don't think in general women shy away from high stress jobs.
Nope.
At all. And even you see law school now, there are more females in law school than men, and more women coming out as attorneys, and so which is a high stress profession as well. And so I think it could be more of a personality thing as well. Do you think?
And then let's talk about that too. Actually, women who tend to go into jobs that we call caring fields, those are hugely stressful. Things like nursing, childcare, social work. All of those things are huge high stress jobs that require extensive amounts of multitasking and things like that. So,
but there's still that element of helping people in those.
Absolutely, that inter and interpersonal.
Right. Do you think
stuff.
that? I mean, when I think commercial real estate, I don't really think of helping people.
No.
So do you think that's a component as well, that it kind of deters women, that they're not so much
making a difference?
Yeah, helping as much as, just serving financial interests, which is very cold.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think, women are, at least my generation was raised that way. We were also raised to be nice and polite and all that stuff, which I'm not very good at. I mean, I know, I know how to act, but I know how to
only around Bray.
I know how to push back and engage in conflict.
Yes.
But traditionally, women are uncomfortable with conflict in that regard, which is why we have such that huge disparities, because we're taught that even when our boundaries are being pushed through, to just be nice and polite and not rock the boat too much, and I think I think that is deeply ingrained.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, and I've heard, and I'm parts of like women professional groups and Facebook and things like that, that a lot of women tend to not go for managerial positions or for promotions unless they feel completely qualified, where men will apply for these positions and they're very underqualified. And so women, I think part of that pruning and that mindset of like, you can't do something unless you're completely qualified, where men just go for it anyway.
And I was very, very fortunate to have a father that just said, you do what you want. You do whatever you want. You're smart, you go and you get it. And he didn't have any boys, and so maybe I was kind of, I was the oldest, I was kind of maybe a little bit of a default, and I was a terrible tomboy in that way. I really was. But because I had that example, and my dad he's a man's man. He was in the Special Forces for 35 years. He's a man's man. But I never, ever once got the sense that he forced me into a role that was considered either feminine or masculine. And so I think I was very fortunate that way, especially considering, and this is not, I'm not insulting Utah, but because we do have, traditional gender roles are just part and parcel of Utah. I mean, you ask anyone in the United States, Utah, we all know what everyone thinks Utah.
Very diverse. That's what we think. It's
That's
like
right.
Colors everywhere.
And all over the place. My son is biracial, and that was an interesting experience for him, being raised here. But in high school, I had to fight to take auto mechanics and shop and electronics and soldering. Those were things that would be useful for me, and he was like, you do that. I already knew how to make 318 different kinds of casseroles and a quilt. So like home ec was not my deal.
Yeah.
But I had to fight for that.
Yeah.
So
Do you think there's a component between the commercial and the residential realm where it's the home itself being a factor, the appeal to women
Absolutely.
to sell? I mean, the product is a house versus a product is a business or a
Right.
big building. I'm selling a home.
Yep.
Is that kind of language or image or commodity a factor?
Absolutely, and I'll tell you why. And I've actually talked to a lot of women about this, because when I told my friends and colleagues that I was going to be going into real estate, they were like, really? And I had my own. I went into real estate, at 42, knowing less than the average homeowner. That's, pretty much was I was starting from scratch, and my first thought was, okay, what is the thing that I could get jazzed about? And I think this is where kind of a woman portion of me, that female portion of me, comes in to match someone psychologically with their safe place. It is huge, and for a woman, their home is their safe place.
Yeah.
Very much, yeah.
And so, to create a psychological match for someone to have that safe and sacred space is a large component. And I've talked to a lot of women who say, yes,
Yeah,
that's
amazing.
it.
I've never
Yeah,
heard it
that's
phrased that
fascinating.
way. Yeah.
I know when I do the deals, right, and have represented client, I don't necessarily. I mean, it's crossed my mind that that's their home where they're gonna be living, right, the sanctuary. But it's more. This is the product, and we're gonna go through a transaction, and it's gonna be numbers, and we
Right.
get you the best price, or if you're the seller, get the the highest price, or the buyer the lowest price possible, and it's very much that pragmatic line of thinking. Not a lot of that, like what we talked about with the MRIs, right?
Right.
Not a lot of that safe word association or danger that goes into it
Well,
when
let-
I'm working deals.
Let me tell you why that is such a huge component, is because sexism exists, and assault culture exists so hugely in this world. As a woman, and I ask my gender classes this. I run a message board, and so, for example, one of the questions I ask on the board: men, what do you do when you prepare to go out at night? What are the steps you take to protect yourself? And then I ask the same thing to women, and we don't even realize it, but there's not a week that goes by that I don't get catcalled or followed. I have to worry about going into a parking garage. We have to be aware of our surroundings 24 hours a day. Our home is the only place we don't have to do that. And that's why I think women associate home with sanctuary.
And
in
then
that
that
regard.
plays right into helping other people.
Absolutely.
I know, like my wife, her first year of real estate, first 18 months, closed numerous deals, over 50. And she connected with the woman. She made friends with clients and it was always the female, right? It was always the wife. And, I think that we're not always aware consciously of what really drives us. So for her, it was just about relationships and having good contact. But, talking with you, I can see that there really is that connection, right? That helping the woman make sure that the home that they pick is the best, the safest. I mean, all of
Absolutely.
those play right into those needs that the female is craving instinctively.
Absolutely. There's a book that kind of illuminates some of those differences and what women have to deal with on a daily basis. And it's by a man named Gavin DeBecker, and he used to be an FBI profiler, but now he does bodyguard work and other things, and he runs a school. He's amazing. Gavin DeBecker is his name, but he wrote a book called The Gift of Fear. Yes.
Yeah.
He also wrote a second book.
Two women know this. I'm like, what is this
Called
book?
Protecting the Gift. And it talks about your children, how you can encourage that protecting the gift in your children.
I gotta read that.
It's incredible. Did you read The Gift of Fear?
Yeah.
Wasn't it amazing?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, and it talks a lot about that gendered feeling of safety or lack of safety.
It was scary reading it because it goes through so many different situations.
Yep.
of things happening.
Well, and it
but
resonates with you because
I feel that
that's
fear,
the world in which we live.
Interesting. So we're kind of running out of time, but on a final note, you know, this, if you could talk to the women out there thinking about getting their real estate license, women out there who are, you know, in the process of getting it or even now have it, is there any, because you and I have talked pretty extensively about these self-fulfilling prophecies,
Oh, yes.
about taking the real estate exam, you know, getting into the schooling, which is all legal. I mean, it is a line of, you know, legal
Absolutely.
thinking and law, which is just pragmatic and
Logic,
right? So, and, you know, I tell our monthly review, every month we have a live review at our school and get the students ready, comprehensive review of
Oh,
everything
I
for the
remember.
test. Yep, you were there. So for those that haven't experienced it yet, just letting them know what's in store. But I tell them, you know, in my experience, I have no stats to back this up, but in my experience of being at the school over 4 years now, and dealing with the students who have failed the exam and come and said, you know, what do I need to study? What do I need to work on? Here are my scores, and we decode this from emails to phone calls to in-person help because they couldn't get past the real estate exam for the first time. It was predominantly female. And I mean, to be fair, there was men that came in too. They
Sure.
needed help, but predominantly female. And I've always wondered, you know, if there is this this difference in exam taking and processing the exam. And we've talked about word stimuli in the MRI and what happens to the brain when
Correct.
things like asbestos are on the question.
Yes.
Right? A danger
Right,
word.
right.
What happens when the student, when the female student is taking that question on a licensing exam versus a male student? So I think there's a lot of women that, you know, are very apprehensive maybe about going into real estate. And hopefully these stats give them comfort that it is predominantly a female saturated field or, you know, very heavy there. What advice or what kind of final thoughts would you give to women regarding the licensing process and being able to do it and that kind of thing? And then success in the field too, performance.
You bet. Well, first of all, no doubt that, and especially when we're looking at this demographic, because this 53-year-old, this middle-aged demographic is hugely important. We already talked about not, you know, STEM fields not being targeted and things like that. But if, and like we talked about last night, if you're, say, put in math too early or math is not targeted towards you or hasn't been because of your, you know, your gender, then, so let's take if you go into math too early, or you have a bad math teacher. You come out of that class thinking you're bad at math. Whereas if perhaps you, the school had waited a year to put you in, your brain will have gone from that concrete 2 + 2 = 4 to the ability to think abstractly 2 + X = 4. Your brain is just not capable at that point. So then we internalize, and not just women, men too, but women predominantly, particularly in my age group, have internalized, I'm bad at math, which then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it did a little bit for me. And until I was in graduate school, when I was doing my graduate studies, and I took an advanced multivariate statistics course, I didn't know I was good at math. And then I had an instructor who was good, second, sat me down and said, forget everything you ever think about what you know about math or don't know about math, and aced the course. And I was like, oh, yeah, I can do this. That self-fulfilling prophecy really, really, really gets in the way of, it sabotages our success, whatever that self-fulfilling prophecy may look like.
So
You know,
you're
we're just
telling
using,
me I could be good at home ec, that it's all in my head.
everything's in your head, Brian.
Okay.
This is what I do. It's all in your head.
Okay, so there's, I mean,
That's one thing.
and we live, I mean, our state here, Utah, we've taken our own stats of our students, and it's predominantly male, only by a few points, but it doesn't match the national demographic. So it leads me to believe that there's women that would be interested in residential real estate, but may have this mental block about the schooling or the exam or that kind of thing. So self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. The other thing that I think is really important that we address is that we realize culturally women have tended to multitask. And when we're taking an exam that is logic and judgment based driven, that overthinking is key to, if you overthink, that is going to actually sabotage your success. You're given all the information you need in the question. You can't read more information there than is in the question. And so, like when I tutor real estate students, I have them underline key words and say, okay, you're given all the information. Let's discuss before we even talk about the answers. And yes, it goes like this and like this and like this and like this. I said, but the question doesn't have any of those things in there.
Right.
And so, read each question twice. Don't overthink it. Don't think about anything that's not there. And then read each answer twice. And choose the most logical answer. And usually if you study enough and if you study the right way, if you have especially if you've been given some learning tools to encode things from your short-term memory into your long-term memory, which is the tools I really try to teach my students that I'm tutoring, because that's key, to use those strategies, because then when you go into the test and you don't know an answer, if a subconscious something comes to mind, that's generally the right one. And never change an answer unless you are sure, or you go through the test and you actually see something that answers that, then you can go back and change it. But don't change it, because if you are utilizing those strategies to incorporate that information into your long-term memory, your subconscious can be pretty on top of things. And the other thing is test anxiety, getting so worked up that it creates a mental block. That's another form of sabotage. And so, a lot of people ask about strategies to kind of lower that anxiety, and basically, and it depends on what kind of person. Type A people are going to be a little more high trait anxiety, a little more internal locus of control driven, but that it's still just a test, and you have all the information that you need right there.
Yeah. So bottom line is, women can absolutely do it. Get through school, take the test, pass it first time. I mean, there's mental blocks to get over, and better test taking strategy is what I hear.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Now, what about when they're in the field? I mean, the people that don't know a lot about the actual practice of real estate and what it entails on a day-to-day thing, there might be visions or thoughts or notions of contracts and big fine hundreds of thousands of dollars and legal liability. Do you see that as a potential deterrent for a lot of women?
Maybe not necessarily a deterrent, but I think it is something to watch out for, because women culturally have tended to be raised to be more empathetic. I think they may also be more likely to have some of these gray areas a little bit in their mind, because they want to help. And the reality is, you just can't do that. You have to be detached enough to say, we can't compromise in any way, shape, or form on these things, just because we feel for this person. It's kind of like trying to get people, qualified lenders, to qualify, even if they're not, because we just want to see them in a home so bad. But
it's your safe place.
Right,
We need
it's
you in
your
your
safe place. But the reality is, like, you're not helping them, and you are endangering your own career.
Right. Okay, so if women know this and they understand the mental blocks, they have better test-taking strategies, they understand some of these, mental preconceived notions there. The bottom line is, it is a field nationally that more women are in there, which leads me to believe that they're, in a lot of cases, more successful than men. I mean, it's kind of this, you go where you see your friends are successful type of idea. And that, even with men, we start a business and we recruit our buddies. You got to do this with me. And so I can see that being a factor that as women become more successful in real estate, they bring more in and say, you can do this. We've done this.
Right.
And it's, now we're at a 2 to 3 ratio of females. So they can succeed in real estate.
Yep. My biggest piece of advice would be, especially if, you are middle-aged, because we do also have, cognitive age-related decline, memory decline. That's just a natural thing. But if you can find someone, and I know you offer tutoring services, but find someone that can not only work with those blocks and self-fulfilling prophecies, but can teach you, put some tools in your toolbox, as it were, to help you encode things, learn to encode things from your short to your long-term memory. And how you tutor and how you teach is a huge part of that. Then that decreases the anxiety of what's ahead, of the test, of finishing the course, of all that stuff, and it hugely increases your probability of success, especially taking the test the first time.
Awesome. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So the biggest thing I got from this takeaway was that some of those tasks and duties that have been traditionally ascribed to females, it's just my own mental blocks that have been holding me back from those. I can totally bake a quiche.
You can totally bake a quiche.
You can.
Okay.
Well, I
You
don't
can
know
totally
about
think
Brian.
like a woman, too.
Think like
Yeah.
a woman.
You should
All right.
sometimes.
So, ladies, those that have been curious about getting into the field, getting their license, absolutely go for it. And,
go for it.
It is the mental, and it's like anything in life, I think, the mental blocks are really the biggest
Yeah.
bar with anything.
Absolutely. And it may, if you weren't raised, with math, or you have a block with math, we're using math as the example, find someone that can help you get over that block, because you can do math.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's no physical limitation at all.
There is no physical limitation.
And then getting over that block, you see that it's a very rewarding field for females.
And it's not as difficult as people think. People have this huge fear of it, but take a stroke victim, for example, someone who's had a stroke. Their brain learns to rewire its neural pathways through rehabilitation in order to be able to do certain things. It's the same with math. If you learn it and you're taught a certain way, your brain will wire itself to learn it. Even if you're never fully comfortable with it,
Yeah.
you can learn it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, like anything. Great. Thank
Awesome.
you,
Thanks
Professor
so
Hill.
much.
My pleasure.
I'm very glad that you came, and this has been fun. We went way over, but I think it was fascinating the whole time.
Yeah,
So.
definitely.
I had a great time.
Thanks so
Thanks.
much for being here.
All right, we'll see you guys on the next episode of The Real Estate Hustle.